Hi, I'm Leon Gorin, president of PEO Leadership, a peer-to-peer leadership advisory firm. We're an amazing community of CEOs, presidents, and senior executives. Ask yourself, are you learning as fast as the world is changing? It's time for Ontario business leaders to band together for counsel and support. It's time for you to tap into the business wisdom of our peer groups and unlock new ways to grow. I want you to come out of this COVID crisis a better leader and your organization ready for what's next. Take the first step at peo-leadership.com. This morning, we are excited to welcome Michael Bier, the Cahners-Rabb Professor of Business Administration, Emeritus at the Harvard Business School. Professor Bier specializes in organizational effectiveness, organizational change, high commitment, and high performance organizations. In 2019, he released his latest book called Fit to Compete: Why Honest Conversations About Your Company's Capabilities Are the Key to a Winning Strategy. Now, before I pass the microphone to Mike, this is how we envision the hour unfolding. Mike will lead off with his presentation, which will take about 20 to 25 minutes. We'll then open it up for Q&A, and I'd ask that you please post your questions in the group chat, and when we're ready, we'll reach out to you individually and ask you to come off mute. So you'll actually get to be able to pose the question directly to Mike. So let's get started. Good morning, Mike, and let me pass the mic over to you.
Good morning, Leon. Are my slides showing properly? Because I don't see you.
I don't see your slides.
Okay, let's try again. I'm sorry about this.
No worries.
Let's relaunch here. Share screen.
There you go. We see your screen and
okay.
We're good.
Well, thank you for the invitation to speak, and nice to see all of you and talk with you about a subject that's dear to my heart. And that is, I think, quite important, not only generally speaking for business and leadership of businesses, but in the current crisis. And maybe we can get into that a little bit later. This is about why organizations fail and what to do about it. If you think about some examples, let me put them up for you. Not on a slide, but at least talk about them. Consider Boeing. You all know about the 737 MAX failure that cost the company $19 billion and lost and resulted in some 300 or more deaths in 2 crashes. How did this great company fail? Most failures are thought to be problems of customer relations, bad culture, poor leadership, bad structure, poor policy, unethical behavior, you name it. There are dozens of reasons that are attributed to a particular failure. The argument I want to make here is that basically there is one fundamental, and I mean fundamental, underlying reason for these failures. And that is that truth could not speak to power, that there was not an honest conversation about what was really going on in the organization in its capacity or incapacity or lack of ability to execute on management's own strategic intent and values intent. That is exactly what happened at Boeing. People in engineering, in other parts of the company, knew that there was something, that they were competing objectives. One of them was to develop a new airplane that was safe, and the other was to get it done on time at a particular financial cost. And they understood that these 2 objectives were in conflict with each other. They could feel it every day in terms of the way they operated and the small decisions they made or they were forced to make to basically marginalize to some extent the safety elements of this, the engineering standards. You could imagine the engineers crabbing about about moving faster than they wanted to go because they knew they were violating some basic standards. So inability to talk about conflicts of objectives. Think about Wells Fargo, which, as you know, in 2016 was revealed. It was revealed that they had created that thousands of accounts were created by their sales force that didn't exist, that was not only unethical, but stupid. People in the organization knew that this was going on. They complained about it. Some were fired about it as a result of their complaints. And ultimately, 3,000 people were fired because they had created false accounts. But the fact is that it was not them who created the false accounts. It was management's own decisions about how to proceed in creating and improving, increasing sales by creating a set of very stretch objectives for sales and incentivizing those objectives in a way that it was very hard for people not to do what it is they knew was not the right thing to do. Now you may say, why don't people step up to that and say something to management? Because they have learned over the years that if you say something that's unpopular with management, you're going to be marginalized. You're going to be called, you're not a team player. You could even be fired, as was a case at Wells Fargo. So people don't speak up. Take, for example, Johnson & Johnson's 2010 successive, and since then, continued successive failures in products they've put out and recalls they've had to make. It turns out that the traditional and historic culture of Johnson & Johnson, of collaboration, open communication, had eroded. And people at the lower levels knew it. They could feel it. They understood the values of the company as had been articulated by several former leaders, but they knew that that was being violated. But there was no way for them to speak up for the reasons I'm talking about. And so this goes on take GE, where Immelt tried to save the company through acquiring Alstom, a French company. Well, most people were telling him that this was not a good idea because they understood a lot about Alstom and some of the bad practices they had in their customer relations and in their product. Every time they thought the acquisition was off, they celebrated. But there was no way to have that sense of understanding of what was going on really made it to get to Immelt to make it part of what I call an honest, collective, and public conversation. By honest, I mean that the facts and the truth are on the table. The whole truth, not part of the truth, meaning facets of management's own behavior, their own policies and practices, the organization design that they had created, and collective meaning that the whole organization is involved in the conversation. You cannot overcome problems of the kind I'm talking about by having a single person, most would not do it anyway, talk to the CEO or talk to key executive because though they would not believe that this person really has the truth, really knows it. So you need a system of having a conversation that involves the whole organization, and it's got to be public. That is internally public, not publicly, not outside, that the conversation is going on. Because unless people feel they're part of a collective that's trying to make the thing better, the organization better, you don't get the results I'm going to be talking about. So let me go on here. What is the conversation about? It's about whether the system is aligned. This is the conversation that should take place, but often doesn't, and very often does not. And by the way, it does not because not only people cannot speak truth to power, but people at the top really don't want to hear. Why should they try? Why should they hear and have a discussion about problems with people over whom they have authority, over whom they have control, essentially? So what happens when you get to top management is you begin to forget not every top manager, but too often, too many, forget that basically they need the collaboration of others to help them be better. And that's what and they're afraid of embarrassing truths for natural human reasons, which I'll get to, how to overcome that, I'll get to in a minute. So basically, this is the conversation that should be had. This is a model that can be changed. It doesn't matter what the elements are. But the basic idea is if you're getting organization behavior of the kind we saw at Wells Fargo or the kind we saw at Boeing, the lack of capability and culture that you really need to be successful is a function of many facets in the organization. Let me take Nokia, another failure. The leader in the cell phone industry up until until Apple came out with a smartphone. They actually knew that the smartphone was coming. They had their own smartphone technology, and they tried to respond. So it wasn't technology. It wasn't they didn't know something was going to happen. It wasn't that they didn't have the technology. They wanted to try to get back in a competitive position to Apple. And they didn't do that well, and books have been written about this, because many of these facets were not aligned with their intent to compete with Apple. The leadership team had not come to an agreement about what the real priorities were in moving forward. Every transformation requires some kind of prioritization and some kind of resourcing of the necessary thing. In fact, they had stretch goals that people at the lower level knew they could not achieve with the resources they had. They could not do it, and also there was no collaboration between functions. They had a matrix organization that was not working because of people attitudes and behaviors were not consistent, and leadership's behavior was not consistent with creating a common collaborative culture. Leaders were leading their own activities and really focusing on their own activities and not collaborating. That probably had something to do with the reward system. It had something to do with the processes. In fact, they later, when they were not succeeding, decentralized the organization, which itself completely undermined collaboration. Everybody in the organization knew it. Lower levels knew that they couldn't be achieving their objectives, but couldn't tell senior management that they would be falling short. So senior management was unable to basically add additional resources or reprioritize projects and objectives necessary to succeed in competing with Apple, and so on. Let me ask you, you all work in organizations. If you work in an organization where you're looking up, ask yourself, do you know some things in the organization that you think need to be changed in order to make the company better? I'd be curious for show of hands. How many of you would be, well, I don't want a show of hands because that would embarrass you if you couldn't do it, but how many of you feel comfortable, that's a rhetorical question, comfortable going to the CEO and speaking up about it? And how many of you do you think if you did, things would really change? In my research, I find that most people in organizations do not think their organization can change because they don't know if leadership could change in a significant way, and they attribute at least part of the problem, a lot of the problem, to leadership, its organization design, its leadership style, processes, reward system. Those are all difficult to change unless there's an honest conversation. And people know that the conversation, even if they know individually what's wrong, don't know how to mobilize energy to really create change. So if you're running your own organization, ask yourself, do I know what really is going on? Whether the organization is operating and functioning, the behavior of the organization is completely consistent with my values and cultural objectives and with my strategy. So that's the key question. Now, this book and the ideas in it started about in 1990 when Rager Martin, then CEO of Becton Dickinson, a global medical technology company, at the time about $2 billion, today $18 billion, in revenue, came to me with his chief strategy and human resource officer. That person was really had two responsibilities. And they said, look, we have great strategy. And we have good strategy. And they had a right to say good strategy because, in fact, they were all previous strategy consultants in McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, and so forth. And the strategy was fine, but they were having problems executing the strategy, getting the organization to behave in a way that was consistent with the basic strategy they were articulating. And so he said to me, could you help me develop a company capable of executing strategy? He didn't just say this strategy, which obviously was an issue. In that case, it was moving products from the US to overseas locations with different regulatory policies and practices, but getting them over there. And that required collaboration between US divisions and US presidents who had the products and had the strategic objectives of moving them, and various countries in Europe, Japan, and so forth. And they were just not having any real luck in getting that collaboration going because of most of these facets were not aligned. The structure was not aligned. The people were not aligned, the reward system, et cetera, et cetera. So he asked, could we create a company help him create a company capable of executing strategy? Because he saw it not only at the corporate level, but at the business unit level. So we had to come up with a way in which a conversation could be had about these matters. And we started out with the idea that this is an analytic problem. So we had to get information to them. Of course, as we began to apply this, not only at Becton Dickinson in the first 2 or 3 years, but in many other companies, in fact, 800 or so different organizations at the corporate level, business unit level, regional level, operating units like restaurants have applied this approach I'm going to talk to you about as a way of getting an honest conversation going. Now, I'm not arguing that that the method I'm going to show you is the only method by which you can do it. It's the principles underlying it that really matter, although we have spent a lot of years figuring out how to get this honest conversation going, particularly in companies where it's not a norm. So this is and we really argue that you need you need a structure, because it's too hard to do it without a structure. Think about how difficult it is to have a conversation with your best friend or your spouse about problems in the relationship. Often you don't have it. You need to have it with a counselor, a therapist who can guide the conversation and avoid mistakes in the conversation. There are too many mistakes that are made. Somebody says something that really they didn't mean to have the result, but it's a negative effect. It's evaluative or whatever. And the conversation has to have a rhythm. If it's difficult at the interpersonal level, it is hugely difficult at the organization level. So you have to have a conversation where the leadership team does not become defensive, where people below can begin to say what's really going on, the truth. And we found this method, the strategic fitness process, enables a safe for management, safe for lower levels, and constructive, honest conversation that's been extremely productive in many different parts of the world. That is, it achieves higher trust and commitment, and it achieves better execution, and where we are able to measure it, improve performance. I'll go into some of this in some examples later. So how does it work? The leadership team has to has to develop a statement of direction. We find, and I'll come back into this, that most leadership teams have not had that conversation. They have to appoint a task force of 8 of their best people that they select because they are going to believe them when they come back with the truth. That task force then carries that statement of direction to 100 individuals, roughly 100 we found, or less if it's a smaller organization, is enough to do it. We've done it at Merck, a $60 billion company. with 100 people worldwide to look at the corporate situation. The task force articulates the statement of direction. In fact, they send it in advance. They interview, each of them interviews some 12 individuals, so you get about 100, somewhere around 100. And they interview them around three things. Does this direction make sense? What are the strengths that we have to achieve that direction? And what are the barriers? And then that then is the inquiry that and the results of which go to the senior team. So the feedback to the senior team is what are the strengths, what are the barriers? And the senior team has to diagnose and say, reflect on this. What does this mean? Why are we having this? Why these attitudes and beliefs in the organization exist? Why does conflict exist where it shouldn't exist, et cetera? How do we essentially redesign the organization? That turns out to be an analytic process, but we've also learned it's a highly emotional process, because people below are feeling relieved to be able to speak directly to management. It enhances their hope that change will occur. For the senior team, it's highly emotional too, because for the first time, they're hearing the real emotions behind what is going on at the lower levels, and it causes them to feel more urgent about basically creating change. In these conversations, we've analyzed these conversations over many years and in detail in about 2 dozen organizations. And we found that there are 6 core barriers, and ask yourself whether you have these, that these task forces articulate as barriers to the ability of the organization to be effectively executing what it's trying to execute. These undermine alignment and agility, the ability to change the organization as strategy changes. And that happens much more often than previously. Consider an organization which is trying to adapt to enter a new business. The task force came back and we're experiencing huge conflicts, cold wars between engineering, which was trying to develop the future product, and custom systems, which was managing for profit on legacy products. What did the task force come back with? You guys are unclear about your strategy. We have 2 strategies that are conflicting, and as a result, we have conflicting priorities. In this case, it was not about values, but we've heard early on at Becton Dickinson that the company didn't have, the task force came back, so we have no human values. We're too bureaucratic. We're not thinking about the human side of the enterprise. That can also be an outcome, an unclarity. The task force came back and said, you guys in the senior team, and they were all men at the, no, actually there was a woman there. So you senior team are not effective. You're not working together. That's one of the problems that we see. Each of you has your own priorities, your own fiefdoms, and you're not really finding a way to overcome that. And you're not getting together to really do it. And why was that happening? Because the leader was, in this case, too laissez-faire. We also heard leaders who too top-down. Laissez-faire meaning he was afraid of having conflict, which he knew would occur if he had a senior team to talk about the key issues. And so he managed it one-on-one. And one-on-one prevented the senior team from really coming together in a way that would allow them to identify the conflicts and really agree on what's the right thing to do here, which is a priority. The new technology, and they had agreed that the new technology was the right approach, but over time, there was so much success in selling legacy products, and there was a pressure for profits that the person running the custom system group began to believe that was the strategy. There was no way to communicate and discuss this. Poor coordination, very poor. They had set up some teams to coordinate some things, but they were poorly designed. The leaders were engineering people, not business people. There was no accountability on the team to the leader. They were really communication meetings. They were not powerful business teams that they needed to create. when we did try to create business teams, that was one of the functions to really create a powerful matrix. We found that nobody in the organization, they had no other people to lead the organization other than the engineering people. They had not developed their own leaders to be able to lead these teams. And finally, most everybody in the organization knew this was going on. One of the senior leadership members of the senior team said it was like a bad marriage. Everybody knew the marriage wasn't working, but we simply couldn't have a conversation about it. And so there was no conversation about the reality of what was going on in the organization, or for that matter, the external realities of strategy and requirements for these new products. As a result, they were not functioning at all. Their performance was poor. They were not growing at the rate senior management expected them to grow. And I want to point out finally that these are mutually reinforcing. This is what goes on in organizations, and it always goes on at a low level. Each of the barriers are basically stress points. But when an inflection like this business unit occurred, they become fault lines, and they really prevent the organization. So you can't create a direction that's clear and everybody agrees on. If you have an ineffective team, a hands-off manager, it results in an unclear strategy. Having an unclear strategy itself undermines an ineffective team. So these are mutually reinforcing. You cannot implement the strategy because you don't have the coordination. You don't have the coordination down on the left here because you've not designed the organization. In this case, they hadn't designed an organization that would allow the collaboration across the activities, the weak teams, the poor leadership of the teams, the lack of accountability of the members of the team to the leader. All those things were not clarified, and so you had poor coordination. On the right, you didn't have leaders who could lead these teams. You need to develop those leaders, and those leaders are not getting developed because senior management is not spending time on talent management. So these are all, and then the final, of course, is, there's no vertical communication. People below knew that wasn't working, just as they did at Boeing, just as they did as well as Fargo, but they couldn't create an upward communication. A low quality of learning is what causes an organization to get stuck and to be unable to respond in a fast and rapid way. The methodology we've created, and there are more steps to it than I had a chance to really go to, but the basic methodology is a way of creating that conversation and improving the vertical communication, getting the truth on the table, and so forth. Now, in a couple more minutes, I want to say some things about the implications. The implication is that organizations need to be able to regularize honest conversations. You can't just rely on it happening. It has to be collective. So you have to create a methodology. And the argument we make is that it's really a basic strategic management process. When you create a strategy, and the unit I talked about decided to do this every year when they created a 3-year strategy, and it's a rolling strategy, they would mobilize a task force would interview, they'd come back with more information about the ability to execute that year's strategy. But what often happened was that new aspects of the problem were revealed, because organizations are complex. They're like peeling an onion. And so the organization began to improve over time. Its results improved. The CEO of the company said, "This is the most biggest, fastest turnaround I've ever seen in a business unit." They really got their organization aligned around the strategy and so forth. And their results showed it. So we're arguing here is that you need to institutionalize some kind of a methodology. If not this one, find a better one, but that allows non-defensive listening on the part of senior management. And that itself, by the way, turns out to be a hugely developmental strategy for the senior team, for the leaders, and for people below on the task force, because they're getting to see the organization in a way they hadn't seen it, so they understand the holistic element of the organization. Of course, this has implications for leadership. We become very clear that leadership is that we have wrong models for leadership. Leadership is thought of as being strong, top down, tell people what to do, hold them accountable. These are all hard ways of thinking about creating a great organization. Well, we found these leaders who had courage to hear the truth, usually motivated by some crisis, but in some cases, for those who were experienced, to see it as an ongoing way. These leaders used a whole different approach. They made themselves vulnerable, and by asking for the truth, and that vulnerability itself created a huge level of trust and commitment, and the ability for the organization to keep learning over time, because it would allow more vertical communication, both through a formal process, but also informally. In one organization, people after 2 years went to the general manager and said, "I want to be interviewed." What they really meant is, "I have something to say. Interview me." So it just opened things up completely. So I think there are implications for leadership and how we select leaders. And the argument I would make is, if you have honest conversations and you ask people to do them and they won't do them, or they don't do it well, or they don't learn from it, that's a indication, by the way, that that person shouldn't be a leader, because these are the essential elements of leadership: being humble, making yourself vulnerable, asking for collaboration, asking for information. A methodology, however, is needed in many cases, because we don't have those kinds of leaders in most organizations, and you need to develop them. So let me stop there. This is a developmental process, both for the organization, the leader, and the senior team. Let me stop there and open up for questions, Leon.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That was great. So questions, please put them down into the group chat, and we'll call on you. Before we head into the Q&A portion of this webcast, first, a brief note about PO leadership from one of our members.
I was made president just before COVID-19 lockdown began.
Nelson Fresco, President, Mila Canada.
We pivoted by compressing our 5-year online strategy into the last 5 weeks.
Surprised? Don't be. Nelson is a member of PEO Leadership, Canada's premier peer-to-peer advisory firm.
PEO Leadership helped me develop my ability to lead with speed. We've seen a substantial increase in online sales, and Mila offices worldwide are following our Canadian example.
The time to step up and lead is now. Go to peo-leadership.com.
So you talked about putting forth that, mobilizing a task force and going down and really asking people below. Public versus anonymous. I mean, it sounds like these are conversations. These are not anonymous conversations.
No, the conversation is anonymous. What is said in the conversation is not anonymous. So the people who are interviewed, the senior management doesn't even know who they are, because the task force decides who to interview across the whole organization. So these are anonymous relative to the individual, but not anonymous to the issues.
And when you've done this in the past, have you gone out, are they interviews, or have they been questionnaires that you've used?
No, not questionnaires. These are open-ended interviews. We call that the Firehose theory of interviewing. Here's the direction. Start talking to me about strengths. Start talking to me about barriers. Just talk. Usually different than surveys. Surveys tell you something might not be right, but they don't tell you what's really going on in a dynamic kind of granular way. This revealed, things about the dynamics of the organization that you don't get in surveys at all.
So what strikes me here is that task force is absolutely critical to the success of this. I mean, and those individuals.
Well, the leadership team is more critical, actually, than the task force, because they have to listen openly and live with a set of rules that we create for them. But yes, the task force is important, but it's never been a problem to get a good task force. The senior team decides on the task force. They have to agree on which people they will believe. Each member of the senior team nominates somebody from their part of the organization, and they have to agree on a team that they will believe when they come back. That's the actual question.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking more about sometimes when you have a culture in an organization that's been set in its ways. Depending on who's on that task force, to be able to ask those open-ended questions, right? Or those questions around what you prescribed here. It takes a certain individual, and it's even more required out of that individual if you have a culture that has been very tightly held, scared, fear about revealing some of this stuff.
Well, there are two things I would say. First of all, we train the task. There's a facilitator for this process. You need a facilitator, either external or internal. We train the task force. We spend a day with them about how to interview. We have them interview each other. That also is their input into the process. And they select it. So, and we tell them how to have an interview through experiential learning. And it turns out that we've never had a problem with a task force being able to interview. And it doesn't matter how closed the culture is. In fact, the more closed it is, the more the signal that the senior team, remember, it starts with a direction. This is what the senior team is asked us to do. And by the way, I should have mentioned, the CEO or the business unit manager tells the whole organization that he's launching an inquiry and action process, that he wants the truth. So right away, this is the senior manager's conversation. It is not a human resource conversation. It is not the task force. It's the senior management who's motivating it. So and that's never been a problem. The truth comes out. We know the truth comes out because we've been there. And we know that silent killers come out, and people tag the senior team as ineffective and all those kinds of things. So these are things that haven't been discussed before.
Okay, no, that's great. Let's go to a couple of questions here. Alicia, I know you're on here. I see your question, but you want to come off mute and ask the question to Mike directly? Are you there? There she is. You got to come off mute.
Hi.
Hi. How often should you conduct these interviews?
Well, the whole process. It's not just the interviews, but by the way, the feedback process, there's a meeting for feedback and so forth. But this process, it depends. If you are doing it on a regular basis, which a number of organizations have decided to do, including Becton Dickinson, 4 CEOs have taken charge of the company using this process. That is, the first thing they did is, this is our strategy. They defined the strategy and the direction, the values, and then sent out and did it. So one way is to do it every time a new leader takes charge. That becomes then a way of actually getting the leader to take charge of the organization, develop relationships with the organizations, and learn what is really going on. Actually, that's quite easy, because whatever problems exist is not that leader's problems, it's the previous leader's problems. And so it's easier for them to do and get into a regular routine. As I said, another way is to regularize it once a year as part of a strategy planning process, which is really strategic management. Strategic management is about understanding what the direction is, learning where the organization is aligned with it, and acting on the result and recycling it. So that's what this, that's another way to do it. Clearly, it should be done when there's a crisis of some kind, or a major, a new strategy. You're developing a new strategy. So let me put it to today's world. COVID-19 is going to require every organization to rethink its future. It's going to be a new normal. What does a new normal mean for our strategy, for our values and culture we want to build? Beyond the immediate things they have been doing to correct for the problem, that's a requirement. This is applicable to this inflection in big time, because you got to get the whole organization to understand what the new normal is, to function within, and it requires redesign of the system. So what I call the system of organizing, managing, and leading. It requires changes in leadership, changes in management processes, changes in form of organization to be able to have, so that should be, so again, an inflection point is a very key point, place to do it.
That's great. Thank you, Alicia, for the question.
Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Alicia.
Can I have Jim Friesen come off the mute, please? I know you've got a question or two.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
A little louder, Jim.
Hi there. Question about organizational size and how these silent killers affect smaller companies versus larger companies. And also curious if you've looked at privately held companies versus private.
I don't think any of those things matter so much, except for small company. If you're saying small, 10 of us, you don't need this process. You sit around a conference table and you as a leader have to create the climate for an open conversation. But once you get into 60, 70, 100, 150, 200, and of course beyond, dynamics begin to develop. Most small companies, by the way, fail. In my research and other people, mostly other people's research, but in my experience, because some of these silent killers exist. So you've got an entrepreneur who's running the thing hands-on, top-down, not creating a climate for honest conversation, maybe not recognizing there's that top-down approach is preventing collaboration. Most small companies fail when they fail to redesign as they grow. Growth involves fundamental change in how you operate. And as you grow, you need to redesign. You need to think about a new structure, the right structure for that phase, given the strategy you have. That conversation often doesn't happen. So what happens is the product, the great product or idea you had carries the company for a while, but then it fails because it hasn't reoriented itself. It hasn't reorganized itself. I mean, in a larger sense, reorganized itself to be relevant to the current situation. So I do think it applies, except in very small situations. As I said, we applied it in a restaurant that was trying to implement a corporate strategy of customer service improvement. And the CEO really asked restaurants to do this. The leader launched the process. They found out that all kinds of things about why the restaurant was operating poorly. Management was being too directive. They were doing the job instead of asking people to do the job. They completely rethought how they were going to run the restaurant. And it made a huge difference. So it applies wherever you're having difficulty, where execution becomes important, effectiveness becomes important, honesty and trust become important as a way of applying it.
Thanks, Jim, for that question.
I hope I've answered the question. I'll be happy to, if you have a follow-up, please let me know.
No, that was great. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Got a question from Brian Murphy. Brian, you want to come off mute?
Hi, hey, Michael. Thanks very much for the presentation. I guess it is a little bit of a follow-up on Jim's question. And you mentioned, the very, very small micro company where you just go into a boardroom and everyone has to be able to talk. And to be honest, when you have a difficult entrepreneur like you're talking about, that could be difficult, but they'll figure it out. I guess the question is, when you're in an organization that is moving from being small to being large, perhaps growing rapidly, and you end up with 50 people, and the entrepreneur is perhaps a big part of both the problem and the solution.
Right.
But where confidentiality becomes a real issue because people are afraid to speak up. How have you seen, or what adaptations have you made to your methodology to deal with those types of companies?
Well, the process as it now currently exists prevents anybody from knowing who said what. In other words, you don't report the person. You don't, in a small organization, you don't report where in the organization they work. You simply say, we've interviewed 50 people. The task force come back as reporters, okay? They're saying, we're not speaking for ourselves. We're speaking for the 50 people that we interview. You interview everybody. In a small organization like that, you interview everybody. But there is a task force, maybe 2 or 3 people. You don't need more than that in a small organization. So you do need a task force because the task force is the shield for people below to stay anonymous. And for them, under circumstances that we create, there's a methodology we use, which is called the fishbowl. They sit around, after they come back after interviewing 50 people, to use this example, they would sit for a day or half a day, whatever it takes, to analyze their data and say, these are the 4 or 5 key themes that we heard. Leadership. Usually it's the silent killers or some version of that, not in those words. And these are the themes. And then they sit around a table and talk to each other about each theme and relay what they heard about projects. In a small organization, you have to be more careful, but at least you talk about what you heard and try to not avoid saying anything about location or particular project that would identify people. And you let the senior team listen. The senior team sits in the outer U and listens, has to take notes. They're ground rules. You can't say that's not right because perception's a fact. If most people saw this, and that the analysis of the task force is to ensure that no one person is speaking. It's a majority that I've heard from that agrees with this theme, and those are the ground rules. Now, I don't see how you can allow how anonymity would be a problem under those circumstances, as long as you don't mention people and where you heard it, or talk about specific projects that which in larger organizations we do encourage, that went bad because of this. Or if the project is a corporate project of the 50 people in the company, then it doesn't identify anybody. But these are the things we heard about why the project didn't get to success, why the product didn't get launched properly, or whatever. So I don't think this is potentially a problem in a small organization. We didn't find it a problem in a restaurant of 50. There was no way the senior team, plus remember, the senior team is asking for this. This is not something imposed on them. They have to lead it. They have to want it. That's the big problem. Most senior leaders do not want to have this conversation, but when they're in crisis, they often will go to it. Some of them want it because that's how they're built and that's what they've learned. But remember, this is not forced on the senior. The senior team has to say, I want to hear the truth. If they're not able to say that to the organization, don't do the process. Then there's something even more fundamentally wrong. Now, in large organizations, I say to the corporate management, if your people don't want to do it, your key leaders don't want to do it, ask yourself about their leadership capabilities. These are fundamental leadership capabilities that we need to build. So I don't see the problem in even small companies, as long as you as a CEO and entrepreneur are asking for it. Now, if you're telling me that, now that gets into a third area that I haven't mentioned, which actually I'm glad this conversation is happening, the boards of directors. The boards of directors' responsibility is to basically see to to be stewards of the company for the long term. In most companies, unless you're creating a company to sell it the next year. And to me, the boards of directors, and I'm writing about this for Directorship Magazine, actually, the boards of directors need to ask the CEO to have a conversation and to come back to them with what they learned about the strengths and barriers of the organization, with the facilitator as an honest broker in the conversation. I've had CEOs, one of the things we asked the CEO to do after having a conversation is to bring the whole organization together. You have to do this and tell them what we heard and what we're planning to do. The CEO of Masonite asked board members to be part of that conversation. So they carried back to the rest of the board, there were 3 or 4 representatives, what they'd heard about the organization. The board needs to know. I've had a particular experience where I had an honest conversation with the CEO. The CEO wanted to have improve something, because this board said there are problems we're hearing about. He called me, we had an honest conversation, said, I want you to come back and with me to meet with the board and tell them about what we heard and what we're planning to do. I never heard from him. A year later, I heard from the board member saying, we hear from the organization that you had this powerful, honest conversation that was very promising, but nothing is happening. Can you tell me about the company? Well, if they had asked the CEO to do it in collaboration and with them to come back, there was an accountability, that call would never have been necessary. The conversation would have been had with the board. So I think there's a board responsibility too. Now, again, if the entrepreneur selects his board, then you've got a sealed system and there's nothing you can do about it. So there's certain circumstances, I suppose, where you can't do it. But I'm just giving you a way in which to think about this. If you are a CEO, appoint a board that is independent enough to say to you, have an honest conversation, tell us what's going on in the organization as people below see it, not as you see it.
That's great, Mike. Thank you for that answer. I'm going to go to the next question. Danny, come on off your mute, and the floor is yours.
Hello, I have a question about with Brian Murphy. You were saying about the leadership, and we can change every now and then the leadership. And won't that be like you were saying that if we change the leadership, he won't be accountable, or he won't, the other leadership won't be his mistakes. So won't we create like confusion with that. Like if, let's say I'm a new leadership, and the past leadership did mistakes, and I won't be accountable around these mistakes. Won't we create like kind of, let's say, like big mistakes, and like I'm not supposed to fix these mistakes because I didn't do these mistakes.
If I understand the question correctly, what about removing a leader based on the argument here is basically this conversation, what comes out of it, should not be used to remove anybody immediately as a result of the process. We've seen a couple of a company do that by mistake. They didn't realize what would happen. They said, let's go to our problem leaders, have them do this process. And as soon as the conversation turned, and then have them tell us what they learned, when they heard it was bad stuff, they fired. Or we didn't fire them, but they put them somewhere else. They replaced them. That is not a way to think about this. This is a developmental process. So in other words, you have the conversation, you hold the leader accountable to reporting to the next level. Vince Valenza, who's the CEO of Becton Dickinson, used this extensively with many of his key unit leaders. He asked them to do this and to report to the senior team at the corporate level what they learned and what they were planning to do. But they didn't remove them if the bad data was there. They would ask them to develop it, to work on it, to improve it. Now, a year or 2 or 3 later, depending on the timeline and urgency, if things have not changed, if the second time they have a conversation, the issues are still the same, or if the performance hasn't turned around after a couple of years, then you can replace the leader, but you've done it in a fair way. It's a developmental process. You've allowed the leader to deal with the problems. That changes the notion of justice. Yeah, people would think it's unjust to remove a leader based on the data you get, and they would stop doing it, of course. But the point is that's not how you think about this. This is a long-term developmental process. So if you know the leader is ineffective, just remove them. Don't use this conversation as a way to remove them. If you know that. If you don't know that, or you're not sure, and most leaders are not ever completely sure, use this as a developmental process. Get a conversation going, get a change process going, see where it goes. So in the unit I mentioned earlier that was trying to introduce a new product, get into a new business in a larger company, they all knew they would be replaced if they didn't fix the problem. But by having the conversation, and they actually improved, and therefore they never got fired. This is really what happens. Look at the CEO of Boeing. He's no longer the CEO. Look at the CEO and some board members at Wells Fargo. They're no longer there either. This is actually a way to save yourself, develop your organization, and be in a much better place. And by the way, everything you think you know that you think nobody else knows, everybody knows. Everybody knows in the organization what's really going on. It's just the inability to talk about it. That's the problem, because of potential embarrassment.
Thank you so much for that question, Danny. We got one more question.
I hope I answered it, yeah.
One more question coming. Miguel, floor is yours.
Thanks, Leon. Thanks, Michael. Michael, at PEO, we tend to talk quite deeply on vulnerability or leadership vulnerability. I wonder if you'd comment on vulnerability and whether there's a right time to be vulnerable and a wrong time to be vulnerable. And, you know, strong leadership is often quite necessary in uncertain times. And it can be, vulnerability can be a thing that even spawns, let's say, doubt in leadership. How to be vulnerable well is a skill. Could you comment on that?
Sure, I'm happy to. Making yourself vulnerable does not mean that you're not strong. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And it doesn't mean that you can't be strong. So the argument here is basically there are two, just simplifying it for a minute, there are two characteristics of leadership that are essential. And they're both important, but one is definitely not used. One is the ability to advocate a new direction. That's strong. I have a vision. I know what our business problems are. I've talked to our customers. And we as a leadership team have done it together. That's very important. And here's what we think we want to do and need to do as a company. And sometimes what you ask leaders to do, what you ask the organization to do, may be difficult. You may be creating stretch goals. You may be asking them to change in some way that they're really uncomfortable change. That's strength. That's strength. But once you've articulated that, the other part of that is inquiring whether that direction makes sense and whether the organization feels capable, the people see the organization capable and effective in executing that strategy. That requires vulnerability, okay? That part of it requires vulnerability. So I'm arguing for coexistence of strength of advocacy about where the business goes, but an equal strength in vulnerability to hear what may not work or is not really as other people see it. Again, it doesn't obligate you to do everything that lower levels are saying you should do. It informs you so that you can create a more complex organization. So I go back to Vince Valenza, the CEO of Becton Dickinson. In 2010, he did one of these conversations as he was taking charge because he had already decided, his senior team had decided that the company needed to become more innovative. Now, he could have just said, we want to be more innovative. You guys go to it, do it. This is what we want you to do. He chose the opposite way. He said, let me hear from the organization. And later he said, look, this informed me and changed my view to some extent of what I needed to do. It wasn't that I didn't have any ideas. He was a very strong leader. He had a lot of ideas. The problem was some of them were not exactly right. And so he began to, and none of us are exactly right. What leader knows exactly what to do? And if they do, they're crazy. They don't know everything. So you need collaboration. And it's the inquiry part that requires you to be vulnerable. And the reason that's important is because once you make yourself vulnerable, you're really saying to the organization, I trust you to come back and not take advantage of my vulnerability. I trust you to come back with information, but not with blaming, okay? And in fact, the process ensures that doesn't happen. And once people see that happening, you're creating a cycle of increasing trust, increasing openness, and so on. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Michael.
Michael, we're pretty well, I know we're at an hour. There's one last question from Liz
Sure.
Beamer that I think would be great if we can take here. Liz, do you want to come off the mic, please? Onto the mic.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Leon. Thanks, Michael. Great conversation. I have a question about on an ongoing basis. So the top reason you found in your research employees don't feel comfortable to speak up on a regular basis. And what as leaders can we or should we do on a day-to-day basis to change the dynamic? It's one thing to do regular scans or task force interventions. I think a company can be even stronger if they have that open communication on an ongoing basis.
Right.
And so I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that, please.
Well, first of all, just to back up, I already mentioned this, simply having these conversations in an organized way is a way of improving on the organization as a system. You can improve on the organization as a system with one-on-one. Now, that doesn't mean you don't want to hear one-on-one what's going on. So, but in this conversation, in most organizations, once it happens, people feel much more open to do exactly what you're saying, to walk into your office and say, this is, by the way, you should know about this. Even by the way, if that happens, you still need a public conversation, a collective conversation to work on it if it's a fundamental problem. It may be a minor problem. That's not important. You can do work on it individually. But to do it individually, first of all, you need to be showing your willingness to listen. So one leader that we know posts the feedback he's gotten through various means, 360s and others, on the front door of his office, so that people know he's signaling, I am vulnerable, I'm willing to be vulnerable. By the way, tell me what's going on. The other is to simply recognize that you as a leader need to ask the question. Would you please tell me, tell me what's going on, or tell me what you think I need to know. Asking that question that I may not know. Asking that question over and over and over again is a way of signaling very clearly on a one-on-one basis that you want an honest conversation. And again, this is all about making yourself vulnerable. Once you show tell me the truth. Let me know what's going on. Now, there is some evidence, by the way, that even when leaders do that, people are not open. Actually, there's actually some evidence of this, that even when the leader asks for it, they're not necessarily always going to get it, which brings me back to why, particularly on a collective basis, on an organizational basis, you need a more formal process. But that doesn't remove your responsibility to try to ask questions and ask for the honest truth. I just want to warn you, though, that you may not always get it. The evidence shows that in most cases, people still do not provide all the information. They may provide you information about technical matters, but they will not inform you about leadership matters. They won't tell you, by the way, your leadership style or whatever it might be is causing us to do this, or is causing us to feel this. Unless you orchestrate that conversation in some way. Now, you can do it in your leadership team by using some of the principles I'm talking about to have an open conversation there. But be careful, one-on-one information may not always give you the whole truth. I'm talking about the whole truth. We can always learn about some other department that's screwing up. That's blaming. That's not understanding what the problem is in a systemic way. But you should make yourself open. Ask for the truth and hope that you get it. But I would not trust that as a way of really understanding what's going on in an organization that's of any size. Now, if you 5 or 6 or 7 you, that's different. You don't need this. You really are banking on that personal appeal as a way to do it. And if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. Or you can ask an outsider to come in and do some interviews or something like that. That's why consultants often do. Consultants do exactly what I'm talking about, except it costs a lot of money, and you can't rely on that as an ongoing method. So we had to create a method for Becton Dickinson that they could use on a regular basis that was their own. And we developed their HR people and strategy people to facilitate these conversations and learn how to do it. That becomes then a capability of the organization.
Okay. Thank you, Liz, for that question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for that response, Mike. That was great. Well, I want to thank you on behalf of everyone this morning, Michael, for joining us and sharing your insights. And Fit to Compete, if you're looking for some more information, please, Fit to Compete's easily available on Amazon. You can go, I've seen it on there.
It's also my website, biermichael.com.
That's great. So please feel free to pick up a copy and continue the conversation going. Mike, thanks again for your talk with us this morning.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I appreciated the questions. They were great.
That was great. If you're interested in the Way Forward live webcasts, please visit us at poleadership.com. You'll find a number of our recorded past webcasts that included Professor Janice Stein, Professor Rosabeth Cantor, and a number of upcoming ones that will include Ron Tite, named as one of the top creative Canadians by Marketing Magazine. I'm wishing you all a fantastic rest of the day and a safe weekend. That concludes our session today.